Good afternoon. I don't have a glass to tap to. We hope you all had an enjoyable lunch. Not so much enjoyment that you'll be, I'll be keeping eyes and make sure your eyes are open. It's very kind of the IGS to include the Ulster Architectural Heritage Society. I always look up to the IGS as sort of our big brothers or our cousins, so it's lovely to combine the two organizations. We're after two, so I will just move directly on to Professor Geoghegan and our keynote to speak, and hopefully there'll be some time for a couple of questions afterwards. So Professor Geoghegan, there.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. In the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell's international reputation, I think, hinged around three different parts of his career. The first was that he was seen as the liberator, the person who had achieved civil rights for Irish people, Catholic emancipation, and had done so by mobilizing the moral force of a country, by making it clear that the voice of a people could not be silenced, and by forcing the British government to concede this major relief act, and to do that without resorting to violence. And that was studied and looked at around the world. The second was that O'Connell was, as we've heard earlier with the caricatures and the portraits, a kind of celebrity. His autograph was widely sought. People were interested in visiting Derrynane. People wanted to meet him. They wanted to see him. And he was someone who was renowned for his oratorical prowess, the fact that he was able to command vast audiences, the fact that huge crowds gathered to hear him, and the way that he also had that kind of edge of danger about him. He could be rude, he could be insulting, he could be challenging, he could be provocative. He could have his audiences bursting out laughing one minute, and then he would have them in tears the next. And people wanted to witness that themselves. And then I think the third element of his international reputation was his huge opposition to slavery. And I think to properly contextualize that, I think we really have to understand that something that seems so obvious now, something that seems so natural and without argument, wasn't in any way as clear-cut in the 19th century. There were some who were still pro-slavery. There were some who were opposed to slavery but still didn't think it was appropriate for an Irish person to comment on things that were happening in the United States or in other parts of the world. And you see O'Connell getting criticized by allies in the United States, including people opposed to slavery themselves in the northern states, but who didn't think it was helping their cause or O'Connell's cause to have an Irishman, for example, criticize George Washington and say that he was a hypocritical president because he owned slaves and only freed them on his deathbed, or to denounce the Declaration of Independence as a hypocritical document because not all people were created equal, or to say that the United States was a contaminated country and that he wouldn't set foot on it until it was redeemed of the sin of slavery. There were many in Ireland and in the United States who were offended by such language. Even Thomas Davis criticized O'Connell's, what he called American philanthropy. And others who were part of that Young Ireland movement, like John Mitchell, very much advocates and supporters of slavery. And O'Connell also was very different from people on the abolitionist cause who supported the abolition of slavery, but did so while still believing in the innate superiority of the white race. And O'Connell was different in that his incredible empathy meant that he saw himself and the enslaved people in America and around the world on the exact same level. And I think that was really quite a remarkable and extraordinary as well. That when O'Connell would drive the audiences to tears, when he would move them to tears by describing the pregnant African-American mother, the enslaved mother, who had no joy in her pregnancy because she knew that she was not passing on a blessing. She was instead giving birth to a curse. She was going to pass on that curse to her own children and their children. And audiences would break down in tears. And O'Connell understood that huge tragedy because even though he hadn't grown up in that state of slavery, and even though the circumstances, as we heard from Professor Brick, were very different, he knew what it was like to grow up in a state of inferiority, to believe that you weren't equal in your own country. He would always say that you could go down any street in Ireland and you'd immediately be able to point out the Catholics because they wouldn't make eye contact with you. They were nervous and insecure and they would shuffle around. They were a people broken down and ashamed. And that part of what O'Connell did was he raised those people from their knees. He made himself a champion of resistance, marching to the forecourts carrying his umbrella as if it was a pike, standing up to the ascendancy judges and the opposing council, defending those who were oppressed. He was making himself a symbol of that resistance, but he was also saying, we are all equal, we are all the same. He bought that house in Merrion Square even though he couldn't afford it, and it put the family further into debt. Why? Because only ascendancy people lived on that square. And again, he wanted to show, we deserve to be here. We are the same. And he made himself a focus for all of those shared hopes and dreams about what could be achieved. And O'Connell was the champion not just of those rights in Ireland, but around the world. And not just for those oppressed in the United States, but wherever he found them. And he was someone who believed that injustice must always be stood up against. When the new American ambassador to the United Kingdom arrived in 1837, O'Connell denounced him, refused to greet him, offended Queen Victoria, who turned against him after initially admiring him, because O'Connell was so vehement about slavery, slamming the door on people who called him if he discovered that they were owners of slaves. O'Connell denounced Stevenson for owning slaves, for breeding slaves for resale, and believed that those who traded in human life and human suffering should be called out for what they were, wolves in the forest. They should not be greeted by any civilized country. And Andrew Stevenson tried to fight a duel with O'Connell over that because he was so offended. And O'Connell refused to meet him, saying that harsh experience had proven to him that duels were not the best way of proving who was right and who was wrong. And John Quincy Adams, the former president of the United States, took to the floor of Congress to denounce a conspiracy of the slave owners against the life of Daniel O'Connell. 3 years later, O'Connell spoke at the world's first anti-slavery convention in London. Charles Lennox Remond, one of the great black abolitionists of the day, said that listening to O'Connell, it was like listening and watching lightning flash across the sky. Remond said afterwards, all my life I thought I was an abolitionist, but I was wrong. Listening to O'Connell made me realize what true abolitionism was. That his condemnation of the slave owners seemed to shake the very foundations of their belief systems. And that was shared by so many of the great African American abolitionists. Frederick Douglass, when he escaped to slavery, was told that it wasn't safe for him to stay in America. So he went on a speaking tour to Europe, but the first country he wanted to visit was Ireland, because he had learned the name of O'Connell from his master, who used to spit out the name with a curse. And Douglass didn't believe all these stories of O'Connell's fame and celebrity, the way he could command great crowds, until he saw him in action when they spoke together here in Dublin. And Douglass said it was like listening to the rolling of thunder across a dusty summer's afternoon. And Douglas very much championed himself as the Black O'Connell of the United States, someone who would go on and try and achieve similar freedom for his people. And O'Connell was different there. I think very often when we celebrate O'Connell or talk about O'Connell, we talk about him as the lawyer or the orator or the political organizer, but not about someone who I think his greatest strength and his greatest quality was his empathy. The way he was able to connect with people who were suffering, and he was able to connect with crowds and audiences. And I think that really was a quite remarkable gift. The way he was able to understand their suffering and where they were coming from and build it into what he was explaining. Charles Dickens was a parliamentary reporter before he became a novelist. And he said afterwards he had to put down his pencil in the gallery of the House of Commons because he was so moved by O'Connell's speeches, that he would have you laughing and rolling in the aisles 1 minute as he would insult some member of Parliament and give them a nickname that would stick, and he would then attack someone else and abuse, and then he would move on. And before you'd even noticed it, he had caught you up emotionally and you were being tears in your eyes and you were swept away. It really was quite remarkable, but it wasn't an act and it wasn't something that he was pretending. And that's why that emancipation campaign was so important for O'Connell, because he felt that he was urging the Irish people to join with him in this great movement, that he believed it couldn't be something that only an elite in London secured for the Irish people. It couldn't be something that only he, O'Connell, achieved. Everyone had to take part. And that was why you had that great crowdsourcing of the 1820s, of the Catholic rent. Those who couldn't afford to pay almost nothing at all would pay that penny. Those who could contribute more would contribute more. But everyone felt part of the movement. Everyone felt that they had a share in it, and that therefore this was a great national cause. And so when O'Connell set out for Clare in 1828 to stand for that election, huge crowds greeted him all along the way. Going into Tipperary, they unhitched the horses and they dragged the carriage in themselves. People came out in the middle of the night to touch the carriage as it went by. People all wanted to be part of this. When O'Connell was elected, they put him in a chair and lifted it up and carried him all the way to Limerick. And then when he tried to give the speech, they drowned him out with their applause and their cheers. And O'Connell joked with them and he said, "This is the first time in my life I haven't been able to be heard." Bonfires were lit on hills to telegraph news of O'Connell's victory. And I think part of the problem, maybe today, maybe in recent years, is that we don't fully understand what emancipation meant. And I think as Ireland has become more secular, people are confused about whether it was about religious practice. Ireland, of course, was changing, and it was a very different Ireland from the one that O'Connell was born into in 1775 to what it was like after the 1793 Relief Act, when Catholics on a limited basis had the right to vote. But on some levels, and Professor Brick was quite brilliant about this earlier, it was very significant for all the reasons he outlined, and in some level, it was not that significant at all, because it was going to mean that Catholics could become members of Parliament. They were already able to become barristers, but now they could become king's counsels and judges. They could assume the higher legal offices. But in many ways, that wasn't going to affect the ordinary people. They were not going to be any better off. I was speaking down at Professor Brick's wonderful summer school in August, and one woman came up to me afterwards, almost kind of upset and disappointed. What was it about then, if it was just this? And I think what we have to understand is that the people at the time felt and believed that it meant an awful lot. And they celebrated, even though they knew that their children would almost certainly not become members of Parliament or judges or anything like that. Because freedom has a value. And feeling that you're equal in your own country has a value. And people celebrated it because it was achievement that wasn't about honors or titles or positions or promotions. It was really about how you were viewed in your own country, and that you suddenly could have that respect for yourself and a belief that your children might someday go on and achieve those great things. And so it was hugely emotionally important for people. But it was an emancipation that I think goes beyond just the framing of it as Catholic emancipation. It is like the great civil rights achievements of other eras, of other countries, of other times, because it was a people feeling for the first time that they were free in their own country. And that was something that O'Connell then brought through into the House of Commons as that champion of freedom and speaking on issues and causes where he felt there was injustice. And I think when he became Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841, that was another hugely important symbolic breakthrough. It gave him a certain amount of legal responsibilities as the magistrate. He liked to joke afterwards that the very first case he heard, he sided against the Catholic priest in the case that had been brought by a Protestant. And he liked to show that that was an indication of the kind of Ireland that he wanted to achieve, where you had that separation of church and state. But it was also a kind of a vindication of all that had gone on over the past 4 decades. 25 years earlier, Dublin Corporation, in a sense, had tried to silence O'Connell. John Norcott de Stair, a member of that corporation and a former Royal Marine, had challenged O'Connell to a duel. And here, it was impossible for O'Connell to back out. And he had fought that duel and killed de Stair. And it was a time when O'Connell was much more reckless in his life. He followed it up by challenging Robert Peel, the Chief Secretary, who he called Orange Peel, accused him of being squeezed out of some factory in England, challenged him to a duel. And then, after being arrested and threatened with prosecution, that duel was forced to lapse. But afterwards, O'Connell, who was at that point only returning to the Catholic faith, a faith he had abandoned as a student in London, then became that huge opponent of violence to achieve those political goals. And at times it was partly pragmatic because he knew a revolution would be crushed like 1798. And as time went on, it became deeply, deeply emotional to him that this was something that would be morally wrong if it was allowed to proceed like that. And I think that's another way of thinking about emancipation, that for 2/3 of the time when O'Connell was campaigning for that, he wasn't even himself a practicing Catholic. That it was something that went beyond religion. It was, as we heard, it was a way of punishing and keeping down the majority of people on the island. And that was what was being overturned with that great achievement in 1829. And we had our conference in Trinity at the end of July, and we heard a paper about Gaza. We heard from a Ukrainian Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Alexandra Matvichuk, who talked about how their cause was the cause of O'Connell. And I think that maybe might surprise people, because again, we think of O'Connell as the opponent of violence, but O'Connell was opposed to violence to achieve his political goals, but he wasn't a pacifist. O'Connell is someone who would have had no hesitation in mobilizing the country in the defense of the country if it was invaded by a foreign power. And O'Connell was someone who, even in 1813, was offering to the British government to raise a Catholic army to fight against Napoleon if emancipation accompanied it. So O'Connell's positioning on these issues is kind of more complicated and more tricky than perhaps a simplistic version of him that has emerged and has been presented over the years. And I began by talking about O'Connell's image and his reputation in the 19th century. I think in the 20th century, his reputation was at times up and at times down, and at times celebrated by some groups in Irish society, and at times neglected, ignored, or criticized by others. And various reasons for that. I think unfairly criticized for being seen as a critic of the Irish language, even though he was fluent in the Irish language and loved the Irish language. criticised for cancelling the monster meeting at Clontarf, criticised because of stuff that James Connolly wrote about him, quite unfairly, about being in favour of child labour and so on. And I think also perhaps because of the way the Irish state was achieved through that revolutionary generation, he was seen as representing the values and beliefs of an earlier, maybe more archaic time that didn't have as much resonance or relevance. And Eamon de Valera quite brilliantly addressed that as President of Ireland down in Derrynane when he opened up Derrynane as this great national centre and resource, when he said that he, de Valera, had hated O'Connell, that their revolutionary generation had hated O'Connell, but that now de Valera realised that they were wrong, that they would never have been able to achieve what they achieved if O'Connell hadn't done what he had done in the 19th century, that if O'Connell hadn't raised a people from their knees and convinced them that they were more than slaves, there would have been no foundation for all that was achieved from 1913 on. And he was proud to recognise O'Connell as the great leader and liberator. And I think things have changed again in the 21st century. And that what I've noticed from all the wonderful events that have been organised, so many in Kerry and in London and in Dublin and in various parts, there's stuff happening in Paris next week and in Rome in December. And this is only for the 250th anniversary of his birth. We still haven't got to the major stuff, which is the bicentenary of the Clare election and Catholic emancipation and so on. But I think O'Connell is finding a new audience and a new relationship with people, because the things that O'Connell stood for and valued and championed are the things that are really under threat and attack around the world. Democracy, the rule of law, freedom itself, information being distorted and manipulated, human rights and civil rights, the value of a people and human respect and human dignity. These are things that are being challenged everywhere we look, and they're being undermined, and human life seems to be becoming less valuable than it ever was. And O'Connell would have very much understood all of those challenges. They were exactly the things that he was fighting for every single day of his life. He would have understood, he wouldn't understand the technology of the present day, but he'd understand our concerns. And his voice on behalf of human rights and human dignity, of oppressed people, wherever they're to be found, the voiceless, the defenseless, when democracy and trust in institutions and trust in the law is being undermined and criticized and damaged and destroyed, O'Connell offers a strong and powerful message to us. And his inspiration in the 19th century, I think, guides and inspires us and should guide and inspire us today. And I think that is ultimately his greatest legacy, that going beyond his achievements in the 19th century, he is still a voice that is very powerful and very relevant for us today. Thank you.
Yes, I think we go from those heights now to the depths, to the liberator in chains. I introduced Brian Crowley to. Now, Brian, yes, go ahead.
That's great. So, thank you very much to Emmeline and the Georgian Society for inviting me along today. Two apologies. First to Maurice and Patrick, who have heard a version of this talk already at the O'Connell Summer School, but I managed to do it in 20 minutes, so I'm not going to interfere with a winning formula. The other thing is just I do have a bit of a cold, and I'm reminded back in the last century when I was an undergraduate in Trinity, I had the privilege of being lectured to by Professor Ian Robinson, who was a very frail man with a very soft voice, a very lovely man, and he came in one day with a terrible cold. And after a particularly bad coughing fit, he said, just to reassure you, if I do collapse at any point, have no compunction about climbing over my body and getting on with the rest of your day. So if that does happen, don't feel bad. So I suppose my interest in the next subject came initially from my involvement in Derrynane House, which is now run by the Office of Public Works, and the collection there, which features an awful lot of material about O'Connell's imprisonment in 1844. And not only material, but also the chapel, the private chapel down there was built in gratitude for his release. But I also started to notice then that in all the national cultural institutions, National Library, National Gallery, National Museum, again, there were really rich material relating to this particular moment. And I suppose my main job is as curator of collections in Kilmainham Jail, and I'm particularly interested in, I suppose, Irish penal history, the use of prisons in Irish political and revolutionary history, and also the material culture associated with that. And what's really interesting, I think, about political imprisonment is what you often have are people who are in a historical moment, who are aware that they're in a historical moment, and also have the time to reflect on this and document it. And as a result, this often results in these incredibly rich collections. So I'm going to concentrate very much, I suppose, on the material culture associated with this period in O'Connell's life, not just objects, of course, but also architecture as well, which I think is particularly appropriate for the Georgian society. So I suppose the story starts with the year of appeal, 1843, a year where I think O'Connell almost gets his second political wind. I think in some ways O'Connell's political career is defined by he's almost like somebody going down a corridor, just pushing doors to see which one is open, which one might work, because so many of those doors are barred against him because of his status as an Irish Catholic. And I think in 1843, they discover, I suppose, a political momentum through this series of major political meetings, these monster meetings. And throughout the year, the momentum grows, and these monster meetings display, I think, his movements, and O'Connell himself had a very sophisticated understanding of the symbolic power of material culture. And this is evident particularly in the locations that they pick for many of these meetings. So in addition to meetings in places like Clifton, you have meetings in places which are very resonant in terms of Irish history. Mullinmast, which was the scene of a great kind of massacre of Gaelic lords in the 16th century. Of course, the Hill of Tara, the former seat of the High Kings of Ireland. And of course, the culmination of this year of appeal was supposed to be in Clontarf, the scene of the Battle of Clontarf, the great victory of Gaelic Ireland against the Viking settlers. And throughout this period, I suppose the symbolism of this was not lost on his enemies in the British administration in Ireland, and I think they were particularly concerned about things like the decision for O'Connell to have a meeting in Tara, as I said, the seat of the ancient High Kings. And interestingly, when he goes on trial the following year as a result of these monster meetings, there's a big controversy about the presentation of the Milesian cap, or was it a crown, in Mullinmast in October of 1843. So he's presented with this velvet crown, which is now in the National Museum of Ireland. You can see it's green velvet with gold shamrocks, and sometimes it's referred to as a cap, sometimes as a crown, and this ambiguity is, I think, something that O'Connell is interested in playing with. I think he realizes that this is a very provocative gesture, and I think his movement means it to be a provocative gesture. I don't think he has any serious intentions of becoming King of Ireland, but I think he's interested in playing with the power of this symbolism. I suppose the other thing that is worrying the authorities as well, and again it relates to Professor Brady's talk earlier about the funeral, is their great power, and that funeral it occurs to me as in many ways the culmination of something that they've been doing for many decades. O'Connell's power comes from his ability to rally people, to rally bodies, and these meetings are literal demonstrations of his political power, and his power comes from his popular support. And again, you can see this provocative playing with crowns. On the 4th of April in 1844, O'Connell lays the foundation stone of St. James's Church on James's Street. There's the ceremonial trowel, which is now in Derrynane. And at the entrance to the church, one of the heads on one side of the main entrance is O'Connell wearing a crown, or is it a cap? So, as I said, I think his use of symbolism is really, really nuanced on occasion, and sometimes, as I said, deliberately provocative. Despite the fact that O'Connell, as ordered, cancels the Clontarf meeting, he and a group of his supporters are placed on trial in January of 1844. And this trial takes place in the Four Courts, and in some ways O'Connell is placed in a space which has served him well in the past, which is the courtroom. The charges against him, these charges of sedition, it's clearly a fit-up. Everybody can see that this is a kind of a perversion of the legal system. And O'Connell uses his skills as a barrister and as an orator to expose the corruption of the authorities and this, I suppose, this conspiracy to try and bring him and his followers down. Initially, there are 12 traversers, as they're referred to, but there are 2 priests, one of whom dies in the meantime, and the other one, the charges are dismissed against him. But this trial, as I said, takes place, it culminates on the 12th of February, but in advance, again, O'Connell issues a proclamation that there is to be no violence, there's to, as you can see here, no riot, no tumult, no blow, no violence. And again, it's really interesting the degree to which he can control his movement as well. Not only can he rally these bodies, but he can also control these bodies as well. There is a long period of time then, there's over a month, or actually 2 months before he's actually sentenced. And in this kind of interregnum period, he goes on what can only be described as a promotional tour over to England. Again, I think in some ways he's bringing the fight to the centre of power in London. There's a huge banquet for him in Covent Garden, in the theatre in Covent Garden, where they take over the entire theatre for this banquet. And then on St. Patrick's Day, again, probably not a coincidence, he's sworn into he's invested into the Holy Order of the Guild of St. Joseph and Mary in Virginia Street Chapel, Radcliffe Highway in London. And you can see here, this is the cap which is placed on his head. He, again, in an interesting echo of Professor Fleming's talk this morning, there's a cloak, a green velvet cloak is placed around his shoulders. And it occurs to me, it's almost as if he's in one of those kind of Arthurian legends. And the night before battle, he is being kind of prepared for battle as he's taken into this sacred order. The other thing, I suppose, I think is quite interesting is the degree to which, in terms of the politicization of imprisonment, that the repeal movement kind of have form in this area. So in many ways, the big campaign of the 1830s was the campaign against tithes, which were a tax on the harvest which farmers, regardless of their religion, had to pay to the established church. And a number of men who were involved in trying to resist against what they saw as a completely unfair and unjust system ended up in the debtors' prison, in the National Debtors' Prison, the Four Courts Marshalsea, which was on Marshalsea Lane, just off Thomas Street. Interestingly, a number of them died, including this farmer Thomas Tyquin, who was from Shinrone in Offaly. And he died in the Four Courts Marshalsea, and the O'Connell's movement arranged a very kind of elaborate funeral procession from Dublin back home to Shinrone. And the newspapers at the time record how the funeral cortege left the Four Courts Marshalsea and then headed initially to Saggart and then on to Naas. And as they went on, there was almost like a relay of clergy at each different town. Crowds of people came out to pay their respects. And again, it's really interesting the language that's used. He's referred to as being a victim cast in chains, cast in a dungeon. And this kind of language of unfair and unjust imprisonment is something that we'll see revived at the time of O'Connell's imprisonment in 1844. So I think there you're seeing the beginning of this ability to politicise imprisonment and also subvert the meaning of imprisonment, where being imprisoned is almost turned into an honour or a demonstration of the value of the victim of an unjust system. So the sentencing takes place on the 30th of May 1844 in the Four Courts, and there's much speculation about where O'Connell would end up. The Newry Telegraph, which was a unionist newspaper and no friend to O'Connell, were very excited and produced a very bad poem called the Kilmainham, a repeal lyric, in which they celebrate the idea that he's going to end up in Dublin's county jail in Kilmainham, where I now work. And they are almost salivating at the prospect that he will be on the cold stone floors of Kilmainham jail, and that this will finally put manners on O'Connell and his movement. I imagine O'Connell had a very difficult relationship with the Grand Jury of County Dublin, which ran Kilmainham jail in 1820, the year that the courthouse, which is just beside it, which is also the headquarters of the Grand Jury of County Dublin. When the year opened that December, O'Connell and his followers were forced out by soldiers at bayonet point when they tried to prevent the High Sheriff of County Dublin from issuing a loyal address to the much disliked George IV. So he was, as I said, no fan of the Grand Jury, and things might have been a bit more difficult for him in Kilmainham jail. Though as someone who works there, in terms of the bingo card of Irish political figures, it would be great if we could have added him to the list of people held there. But he is instead held in Richmond Bridewell Penitentiary. So this is the male prison for the county of Dublin since 1836. It was built, it was designed by Francis Johnston. It opened in the 1810s initially as a house of industry for people convicted of fairly minor crimes. And as I said, it was this the city jail for Dublin. There was a big reorganisation of Dublin jails in Dublin City in 1836. Richmond Bridewell, which had been a house of industry, became an all-male prison, and the other prison that Francis Johnston designed in Dublin, Grange Gorman Penitentiary, it became the first all-female prison in Great Britain or Ireland. Johnston, although he had many fine qualities as an architect, not great at prisons either, not particularly. They were much disparaged in the years that followed in terms of their design, which was quite old-fashioned even for the 1810s. But what's crucial is the fact that at that stage prisons are still run locally. Richmond Bridewell Penitentiary is run by Dublin Corporation, and as we heard this morning, Dublin Corporation, the stranglehold that the unionist vested interests had on Dublin Corporation had been broken by O'Connell when he became Lord Mayor in 1841. So effectively it's his movement that are running the corporation, which is responsible for the prison in which he's going to be held. So this, is good news for Daniel O'Connell, but also I would, in fairness, would say it's also something that the authorities are probably very pleased about also, insofar as it's in nobody's interest. They don't want O'Connell, any reports of O'Connell being ill-treated or being in bad conditions. They're already making such propaganda out of the fact that he's in prison that if there was any suggestion that he wasn't being treated well or that his health was maybe suffering as a result, that would have been bad news for the powers that be also. So for those of you who are unfamiliar where Richmond Bridewell was located, this is it in its current form. This is it. It's now Griffith College. It later became Wellington Barracks and then became Griffith Barracks and is now Griffith College. And I don't know how to, sorry. Yeah, so this is Johnston's original jail. And then in 1836, when this big kind of reorganization, this more modern radial design prison or section is added, and O'Connell is going to be in the central part here. We'll probably get a slightly better look here. So again, this is the entrance into the gate into the jail, and where G is there, this kind of central block is the governor's and deputy governor's quarters. It turns out that Thomas Purdon, very generously apparently, as governor of Richmond Bridewell, offers to move out, as does his deputy governor, and make his private quarters available to O'Connell and his followers. And he said he very generously does that to Dublin Corporation, which, as I said, is largely controlled by Daniel O'Connell's political movement. And almost immediately then, T.M. Ray, who was the secretary of the repeal movement, gets to work recording and documenting the imprisonment of O'Connell and his followers. So they commission Henry O'Neill, who specialises as, is best known now as an antiquarian and architectural artist. They commission him to come in and like a good antiquarian and architectural artist, he does a series of pictures of the quarters of the prisoners along with dimensions, which are incredibly useful actually. So you can see here, again, for those of you familiar, that's the clock tower, so the street is kind of the other side, and we're looking now at this kind of central block here. That's where O'Connell and his followers are being held. And interestingly, they start to name different parts of the prison that they have access to after places associated with the year of repeal. So this is Mullamast. So this is in Governor Purdon's garden, just at the side of the jail. And they put up this little tent to shelter in from the sun on sunny days, because they spend the summer there. But again, I think there's a jokiness involved and a bit of camaraderie in terms of naming this place as Mullamast. We'll also see there's Tara Hill in the Deputy Governor's garden, which probably allowed very nice views across to the Dublin Mountain. The canal is just at the back there, and you can see there the Deputy Governor has a beautiful garden actually, lovely herbaceous borders. I think this Tara Hill and Mullamast naming, it's playful, but it's also, of course, when people visit and write about it, again, they're talking about the year of repeal. They're remembering and putting back into the public mind the year of repeal, the reason that these prisoners have ended up in jail here, and remembering the great triumphs of 1843. So this is, they set up a private chapel for O'Connell, so he doesn't go to the prisoner's chapel, and he has Mass there. This, as Patrick mentioned, O'Connell becomes quite devout later on in life, so there's Mass and prayers there every day. He's often joined by the Catholic fellow prisoners, and again there's a rotating kind of list of priests who come in to say Mass. So the Archbishop of Tuam comes in, the Bishop of Newfoundland comes in, and again, I think the focus is very much about keeping the eyes of the world on Richmond Penitentiary. You can see here there's a general drawing room, though apparently the prisoners spent most of their day in their own quarters, and then it was really in the evening that they came together. They came together for dinner, they dined together, and then I suppose socialized in the drawing rooms afterwards. So you can see here the dinner, they would often have guests. The prisoners brought in family members as well, so they would have their family. So T.M. Ray had his wife and children in here with him. O'Connell, we'll be seeing, he had members of his family. And then there were invited guests as well. So apparently there was never less than 30 people for dinner any night in Richmond. And again, look what O'Connell is wearing. Is it a cap or is it a crown? So this is O'Connell's bedroom, and we can see he has these, he favoured a standing desk. So he's well ahead of his time. He would be perfect with the tech bros at the moment. And then O'Neill does these amazing series of depictions of the interiors of the prisoners. Many of them had a bedroom and a sitting room. This is T.M. Ray's, again, the person who's responsible for so much of the documentation. And what I like as well is you can see like these slightly irregular shaped rooms because of the shape of that part of the jail. And not only are these amazing documents of this part of O'Connell's life, but they're also amazing documents of interiors of kind of middle class or upper middle class homes in Ireland in the 1840s. You can also see T.M. Ray's daughters here playing on the ground, which I think is a lovely little detail. In addition, Alexander Toussaint Dubray had received the license to do daguerreotypes in Ireland. The daguerreotype was introduced in 1839. He set up a studio on top of what is now the Ambassador Theatre in the Rotunda complex at the top of O'Connell Street. And I suppose it was good publicity for him with his new process, and good publicity as well to come in and take the photograph essentially of O'Connell and his followers. So this, as far as we know, is the only surviving photograph of O'Connell. There was another one. There's an engraving based on a daguerreotype taken of him later on. But this is the only daguerreotype that survives. Anne Hodge and Peter Harbison have written an amazing article about these daguerreotypes and the O'Neill watercolours, which appeared in the Irish Arts Review. But it's amazing just to see O'Connell, who we're so used to seeing in portraits, and we imagine him almost in kind of as a living engraving, to see what he looked like. And again, look what he's wearing. That was clearly that particular gift was a hit with him. And then you can see some of the other men who were in prison with him. So you have Charles Gavin Duffy, who's the editor of The Nation, Richard Barrett, who's the editor of The Pilot being kind of the in-house newspaper in many ways of O'Connell's movement. And then Sir John Gray, we saw his headstone earlier, in the talk on Glasnevin Cemetery, who was the editor of the Freeman's Journal. And again, I think when you see these, like the three editors of the main Catholic nationalist newspapers in prison with O'Connell, I think it's an interesting representation of the dysfunction of Irish society at the time, that all these three men are being arrested by the ruling authorities. And then you have John O'Connell, who is O'Connell's son, Thomas Steele and Thomas Matthew Ray. These photographs, these daguerreotypes, ended up with Thomas Matthew Ray, and it was his daughter, actually, maybe the little girl in that drawing, who sold them to the National Gallery for £5, I think, towards the end of the 19th century. T.M. Ray, as I said, he is meticulous in documenting. So down in Derrynane, you see these glasses in which you see his very tiny little writing. He inscribes with a pin the history of these glasses that were used in Richmond Bridewell. This is Daniel O'Connell's soap dish, used by him in Richmond Bridewell, according to his inscription, and his toothbrush holder. Again, everything becomes important. Everything has to be documented. Everything has significance because it is involved in this historic moment. In addition, artists, more conventional artists, are invited in. So this is an engraving based on a painting done by Nicholas Joseph Crowley. This appeared, Charles Gavin Duffy, he rather bitchily, I think, said that it was a very flattering portrait and that this portrait here by Carrick was a much more representative of what O'Connell looked like. Definitely this one, it is much less flattering. But interestingly, this is the one that O'Connell seems to have favoured as his official portrait. And you'll see this advertisement where in this letter, it mentions the fact that Daniel O'Connell is sending a copy of this engraving to the mayors and heads of councils all over the country. And he's sending it from Richmond Bridewell. So it's almost the equivalent of like the monarch's picture that went around to every corner of the British Empire. So again, it's all part, I think, of O'Connell wanting to keep his name and his face in the public imagination. And you can see here, in terms of the repeal movement, just here, this little button is actually one of the repeal movement buttons. So again, it's, I suppose, his gesture as well towards the repeal movement. So I suppose if there's an official portrait of his imprisonment, it's this one rather than the more flattering Nicholas Crowley one, which is kind of interesting because, as we heard earlier, O'Connell was an incredibly vain man on occasion. O'Connell was joined by members of his family, so Ellen Fitzsimon, Nee O'Connell, his oldest daughter, she came into the jail, as did his daughter Betsy French, as she was at that stage. They came in to keep home for him. And obviously John O'Connell was in the prison as well with his wife, Eliza O'Connell. This is her scrapbook that she kept while she was living in Richmond Bridewell with her husband, children and father-in-law. And you can see here lots of, just a really interesting kind of insight into what she was doing to pass the time and deal with the boredom of imprisonment. Also, as I said, there were lots of regular visits. So this is interestingly, this is by John Gubbins. Ben earlier, he mentioned that O'Connell had commissioned portraits not just of himself from Gubbins, but his entire family. And it's a really interesting snapshot of the family in the 1810s. So this is his wife Mary and his namesake Daniel Jr. This is a prayer book that he gave Daniel Jr. On Daniel Sr.'s birthday. It's kind of slightly unusual. He gave a present to his son on his own birthday. But Daniel used to visit his father, and then he would go to Conciliation Hall, which was the headquarters of the repeal movement, where they would meet and have meetings, and he would give kind of a weekly report on O'Connell or read out a message from O'Connell. So again, it's really interesting the degree to which, although he's in prison, O'Connell is very much still completely engaged with what's happening with the movement. As I said, so you can see there, Mary O'Connell died in 1836, and Daniel O'Connell is definitely devastated by that, and while he's in Richmond, I think he has a moment of kind of old men's foolishness. And Charles Gavin Duffy again reports about his infatuation with a young woman, Rose McDowell, who was old enough to be his granddaughter, and in addition to that was also a Presbyterian, so considered a very unsuitable future partner for Daniel O'Connell. As Gavin Duffy reports then, he said that his family were very worried about this infatuation which O'Connell developed for Rose McDowell, and were probably relieved by the fact that Rose McDowell herself did not welcome his advances. And he writes, their fears were allayed in the end by the lady's persistent refusal to become his wife, but this result was not calculated to restore the composure of O'Connell. In truth, it left him discontented and perturbed in a high degree. And what's interesting is, again, because all of this is happening within the very confined and claustrophobic conditions of a prison, the story leaks out and it's widely reported in the newspapers at the time. And, you know, people are quite disparaging about this kind of slightly pathetic infatuation of this older man with a much younger woman who's considered in many ways completely unsuitable for him. But as I said, Rose McDowell quickly, like Taylor Swift, asks to be removed from the narrative of O'Connell's life. Gavin Duffy also talks about there were amateur theatricals. So he says John O'Connell, who was indefatigable as a master of revels, projected private theatricals and got Julius Caesar into rehearsal no Cassius being forthcoming among the convicted conspirators, he brought from the outer world beyond the walls his cousin Maurice Lane to undertake the part. One might argue that a few years later that Gavin Duffy himself plays the part of Cassius, who betrays the leader, Julius Caesar. But anyway, as I said, there were visitors to the jail. In fact, there are so many visitors to Richmond that rules are drawn up. So there are some days, you can see this appears in Saunders' newsletter in June of 1844. He says that gentlemen need to present their cards, ladies do not. It says that no one can be admitted on any future Monday or Wednesday, and that on Sundays no person can be admitted from the afternoon or until 4:30. And what O'Connell said to one of these visitors, he says the worst thing about prison is you can't say you're not at home to visitors. You have to see them. And again, it's really interesting in the material cultures that this developed. So this glove is down in Derrynane. It was owned by a woman called A.M. Bentley, and she wrote inside it that she had worn this glove when she visited O'Connell on the 10th of July, 1844. My favourite one, however, is the Blennerhassett boys. So long before the O'Sullivan brothers of Skibbereen, you had the Blennerhassett brothers of Blennerville. Roland and Arenberg were the sons of Dr. Henry Blennerhassett, and along with their friend William Collis, young Reardon, who's only ever referred to as young Reardon, and the juvenile helmsman, so we don't know who the helmsman was. These are teenage boys, and they decide to borrow Dr. Henry Blennerhassett's boat, the Colleen Das, from Blennerville, and they decide that they will row on the 29th of June to Dublin from Blennerville in Kerry. So they head out into the Atlantic, go around Kerry Head and go up towards Limerick. And it's only when they get to Limerick that they decide to send word home to their parents of their plan to go to Dublin, at which point I presume they're far enough away that no one can stop them. They then go up the Shannon, up through Lough Derg, up beyond Banagher to presumably Shannon Harbour. Then they head across the Midlands on the Grand Canal, which handily flows to the back of Richmond Bridewell. And I think it's on the 10th of July that they arrive and are invited to dinner, and are celebrities, and then they have to make their whole way back again. But I do like the idea that they got to Limerick and they went, "Hey, Mum, yeah, I've taken the boat. I won't be home for me dinner." There are much more distinguished visitors. So on the 13th of June, there are deputations from nearly every Irish corporation. So the Lord Mayor of Cork and Limerick and Waterford and Kilkenny and all the big towns, Clonmel, Ennis, Roscommon, Carrick-on-Shore and Galway, they turn up at Richmond Bridewell. And again, I think what they're doing here is showing support for O'Connell, but also I think they're showing the weakness of the British authorities in some ways, because what his imprisonment has shown is they can imprison O'Connell, but they can't really punish him, that they have lost control. And again, it comes back to that control that they have over Dublin Corporation and the corporations around the country. And in some ways, I think these very formal delegations make a nonsense out of his imprisonment. Professor Will Murphy in DCU, who's written a lot about Irish political imprisonment, has said that one of the things you do as a political prisoner is try and make your captors look ridiculous if you can. And I think in some ways that's what they're doing here. Of course, the ultimate way to make them look ridiculous is to escape, which is not something that O'Connell was contemplating. And similarly, as well as these delegations, there's also meetings around the country. This is just one example. This is one that happens very nearby Richmond. This is St. Patrick's Ward, which is the ward just next door to Richmond Bridewell. And in Mr. O'Neill's spacious field on Pleasant Street, they have a big rally on the 18th of June. But this is replicated in towns and villages all around the country, these demonstrations in support of O'Connell and the prisoners. One way as well of kind of consolidating support is political presentations. So there's any number of things that are donated and presented to O'Connell. This is a loo table, which is given to O'Connell, apparently carved out of a single piece of wood. And again, in terms of that symbolism, You can see here we have the wolfhound. There are shamrocks, the central column. Again, in an interesting echo of the grave in Glasnevin, the tomb. The central column is a round tower, and the hooves here, these deer hooves, I think are a reference to the O'Connell family crest. So this is given, I think, probably the 4th of September 1844, just before his release. And again, this ceremonial chair was presented to him on his 69th birthday on the 6th of August. Again, is it a chair or is it a crown? A very provocative gift, I would argue, made by Patrick Beakey, a furniture maker in Stafford Street in Dublin, with the carving by a craftsman named Gauson and the tapestry work done by his sister. And again, if we look at the front here, we see our old friend, the cap, or perhaps crowned. So again, I think now we'd call this trolling of the authorities. And then you have these kind of smaller gifts as well. So this is presented by Reverend John Spratt on behalf of the Christian Doctrine Confraternities of Dublin on the 4th of September. It's made from Wicklow gold. And again, W.J. O'Neill, Daunt, describes how the convicted patriots received numerous presents of fruit and flowers. A patriotic confectioner presented them with 2 monster cakes for a monster meeting. Mr. Scriber of Westmoreland Street sent them 7 musical boxes to cheer their imprisonment. And it is said that immediately on the arrival of the harmonious cargo, the prisoners evinced their satisfaction with more musical zeal than taste, namely by setting the 7 boxes all playing together. So I said there's all kinds of gifts, and again, this is a great way of rallying support, and also it enables people to demonstrate their support as well. These political presents are often deeply political and are a great way, as I said, of kind of demonstrating support. Eventual release comes on the 5th of September 1844. You can see here, this is an illustration of the news arriving to Richmond Penitentiary. And there's a story that apparently there was a great competition in terms of who could get from the mailboat the quickest to Richmond Penitentiary to bring the news that the House of Lords had ordered that O'Connell and his followers were to be released. And interestingly, T.M. Ray, of course, as always, decided to document the fact that, so on this glass, and we saw these glasses earlier, he very carefully writes that this is the glass used by the Liberator at his last dinner in Richmond Jail. They were actually released on the 5th of September, but they returned on the 6th. O'Connell walked home from to Merrion Square, but they returned on the 6th, and they had a garden party in the Governor's Garden and the Deputy Governor's Garden. And you can see these ornamental cards, which people then went around to get the autographs of O'Connell and all his fellow prisoners. So, as a completist, you had to get all of them. So you can see here, this is O'Connell walking home on the 5th. And again, this is him. This is from the London Illustrated News. He addressed the crowd then from the balcony of his house in Merrion Square. And again, this is from the National Library's collection, but it comes from T.M. Ray. So again, it's really interesting how T.M. Ray is so crucial in documenting this event even today. He returned then on the Saturday. So they have the garden party on the Friday, and then on the Saturday he returns for a mass of Thanksgiving. He goes inside, and then he emerges from Richmond Jail on top of this, which is now down in Derrynane, this ceremonial chariot, which we believe was probably made specially for the occasion. So apparently O'Connell was on top of it. He was joined by his son John and his chaplain, Father Miley, and then his grandchildren, which Patrick mentioned, his grandchildren that he was so fond of. They emerged out dressed in green satin suits with white ostrich feathers in their hat. And in an interesting echo of the funeral procession, he starts then his procession back into Dublin, but does not go the quickest route. He goes down the South Circular Road, interestingly, he goes past Kilmainham Jail, probably saying, yeah, you didn't get me, much to the disappointment of the Newry Telegraph. He passes the four courts as well. You can see here, in addition to the grandchildren, his chaplain, he also had a harper playing music as it went along. And then they got to College Green, and then he very symbolically points towards the old Parliament House, because of course that is the great goal, the great aim of the year of repeal. And again, you can see it again, this really is the climax of the whole event. And it is this real moment of triumph. And again, it's so many echoes again of Katie's talk earlier and Joe's talk about the ability of his movement to get a crowd out. So there are thousands of people across the city, and they are everywhere. I haven't come across whether there were prices involved in getting a good spot on College Green that day, as there was for his funeral. But again, I suppose one of the great tragedies is the fact that although he's released in 1844, the political momentum of the Year of Repeal doesn't continue. And in 1847, he dies, and there's a great tragedy to O'Connell's last years. His health starts to fail, and when famine hits, he goes to Westminster, that place where, as Patrick was talking about earlier, where he was able to command from the best acoustic spot in the whole hall, and he had commanded that chamber for so many years. But in the 1840s, when his people really needed his help, his voice failed, and people said that he couldn't be heard because of his health. And then he goes, I think, in great sadness then, in the knowledge that he hasn't much longer left to live. He heads to Rome and gets no further than Genoa. But again, it was interesting, again, looking back at Professor Brady's talk earlier, how the ceremonial coach appears again in the funeral procession outside his house in Merrion Square, and again, very melancholy image, the empty chariot outside the Parliament House. And in some ways, it's easy to see, like, there's a ridiculousness to the chariot. There's a camp quality that I really appreciate. But as someone who appreciates camp is also really powerful. And I think in some ways, what O'Connell is trying to do in terms of this revival of the ancient Irish past and this ceremony and this use of ceremony and symbols is an attempt to counteract the pomp and ceremony of the British Empire, because in many ways these empires, their great power is often in ceremony, and there are these demonstrations, these displays of strength. And for a country who I think have gone through maybe centuries of cultural decimation, what O'Connell is attempting to do is to say to, I suppose, Irish people that they come from this long and ancient and rich civilization, and that they are more than capable of doing exactly the same kind of thing that they see the British Empire doing on the streets of Dublin. So I think there's a real kind of seriousness as well to things like this chariot and to these kind of set pieces around his imprisonment in Richmond. I suppose the other thing that I think, just to finish up really quickly, that I think is really significant is the degree to which O'Connell and his movement create a template as well for the subversion of imprisonment in Irish political and revolutionary culture, and the use of prison as a political tool. So just 4 years later, his former followers find themselves in a number of Irish prisons. So this, again, interestingly, another photograph, a very early photograph of Thomas Francis Marr and William Smith O'Brien in either Clonmel or Kilmainham jail. When William Smith O'Brien is in Kilmainham jail, we think he was in these rooms here, and the Illustrated London News are very disparaging, saying that crowds of people are coming out to Kilmainham to gaze up at the room where William Smith O'Brien is being held, and they say, and the only people benefiting from this are the local cabmen and.
Sorry, Dr. O'Brien, on your great discourse, but which one is Marr, which is O'Brien? I missed that. Sorry.
I think that's William Smith O'Brien. I think that's Marr. I'm not 100%. Oh no, yeah, it's in the order that they're written. So the Illustrated London News says that the only people benefiting from this are the cabmen and the local pubs in Kilmainham. And as someone who works in Kilmainham jail, we're proud that we still support the local taxi and pub industry in Dublin 8. And you can see here as well, like these, there's lots of, these are kind of ceremonial, almost autographs from the Young Irelanders. And I think they're very much following a template set down by O'Connell. And this continues, I think, throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, where imprisonment is weaponised by Irish nationalists from the constitutional and the revolutionary side. People like Jeremiah Donovan Ross, the Land Leaguers in the 1880s. Again, in 1916, the War of Independence and the Civil War. And I think, you know, it's really interesting. In the 1860s, when the Fenians are in prison, is when you get the famous Irish ballad, which refers to the idea that the felon's cap is the noblest crown an Irish head can wear, and being imprisoned almost becomes a badge of honour. And I think a lot of that stems back to Daniel O'Connell and those amazing months in 1844. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.